The sun, a merciless executioner in the metallic blue sky, beat mercilessly down on the plain of Jericho. The dust, fine and omnipresent, rose in small lazy eddies with each breath of the hot wind, covering everything with a suffocating ochre blanket. In the distance, standing like a defiance carved in stone and mud, rose the city, Jericho. It wasn't just a city, it was a symbol, a bastion of an era that refused to die. A fortress that seemed to rise not from the earth but from the deepest nightmares of a people. Its cyclopean walls stretched toward the sky with a millennia-old arrogance. They were so thick that war chariots could travel side by side on them, and so high that they made anyone who dared to raise their eyes to its battlements feel insignificant. From above, the tiny silhouettes of the Canaanite sentinels stood out against the sun, watchful eyes scanning every inch of the Jordan Valley. The air, heavy and still, smelled of fear, dry earth, and the unshakable confidence of those who believe themselves impregnable. Behind those walls, life pulsed with a tense normality, a bubble of pride and fear, awaiting the onslaught of the storm they knew was inevitable. And the storm, indeed, had come. But it was not an army like the ones they knew. It did not come with waving banners or the chaotic rumble of iron chariots. On the other side of the river, now dry from the miraculous parting of the waters that Yahweh had wrought, stretched a sea of an entire people, exhausted but imbued with a faith newly forged in the desert, camped there. They were not professional soldiers, they were shepherds, artisans, the elderly, women and children. It was the people of Israel, led by a man whose name was beginning to be whispered with awe even within the walls of Jericho. Joshua, son of Nun. Joshua stood on a small rise in the ground, removed from the bustle of the camp. His gaze, grave and penetrating, never left the cursed city. The lines on his face, etched by decades of desert sun and the burden of a leadership he never sought, seemed deeper today. On his shoulders rested not only the weight of military strategy, but also the divine promise. He remembered the words of Moses, his mentor, now deceased. "Be strong and courageous, for you will lead this people into the land I swore to give them." And he remembered, with a clarity that made his skin crawl, the appearance of the commander of Yahweh's army, a drawn sword in his hand. This was not an earthly battle that was approaching, it was an act of faith, a ritual of obedience. The Israelite camp was a living organism, a human anthill, where anxiety and anticipation mingled in equal measure. One could smell the smoke of the fires, hear the bleating of the flocks, the cry of a child, and the constant murmur of thousands of voices. But above all, an unspoken question hovered, a silent echo in the eyes of every man and woman. How would they tear this down? Their swords were bronze, their shields leather. They had no battering rams, no siege towers. They had only a promise. In Joshua's tent, the tension was palpable. Caleb, his lifelong companion, the only other spy who 40 years earlier had raised his voice with faith in the face of disbelief, stood at his side. The elders and tribal leaders formed an expectant semicircle. The air inside the tent smelled of sweaty wool and determination. "The orders will not come from my mouth, but from the Lord's," Joshua began, his voice rough as sand, but firm as rock. Everyone held their breath. "It is not our strength that will triumph, but our obedience. Our faith, not in our weapons, but in His word." And then he laid out the plan, a plan that from any human perspective bordered on utter madness. There would be no frontal assault. There would be no conventional encirclement strategy. For 6 days, the entire army, all the men of war, were to march in complete silence around the city. One complete circuit each day. They would be preceded by the priests, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the tangible symbol of God's presence among them. 7 priests would march before the ark, blowing ram's horns or shofarim. But the people, the immense multitude, were to remain absolutely silent, not a word, only the sound of their feet on the ground and the shrill wailing of the horns. Skepticism was instantaneous. They looked at each other, disbelief etched on their faces. March in silence. Was that the grand strategy for defeating Canaan's most fortified city? A Canaanite general would have laughed himself silly. But then Joshua added the last part. On the seventh day, he said, his voice taking on a blood-curdling solemnity, we will march around the city 7 times, and when you hear the prolonged blast of the shofar, then all the people shall shout with a great shout. Faith is often the courage to look foolish for a divine cause, and at that moment, on the faces of those leaders, a silent battle was waged between human logic and divine faith. The first dawn over the Valley of Jericho found the Israelites in formation. It was not the formation of an army ready for battle, but that of a pilgrim people. At the front, the priests, dressed in their ceremonial robes, raised their shofarim to their lips. Their faces were pale, but their hands were steady. Behind them, between 4 bearers, the Ark of the Covenant, made of acacia wood overlaid with gold, gleamed faintly in the rising light, an object of austere and terrible beauty that contained the law and the promise. And behind them a multitude, thousands of men, their swords drawn but lowered, their faces a mask of forced determination over a layer of doubt and fear. Women and children watched from the camp, their hearts beating in unison with those of their husbands and fathers. Joshua, in his simple robe, walked among them, his serene presence a balm for the collective anxiety. From the top of Jericho's walls, the scene must have been surreal. The sentries sounded the alarm, and soon the battlements were filled with onlookers and soldiers. First, there was laughter, mockery, shouts of contempt. What kind of army was this? Were they going to surrender out of boredom? They hurled insults, waved their weapons in defiance. But the Israelites didn't respond. They didn't look up. They didn't quicken their pace. The only sound that broke the silence, apart from the whisper of the wind and the crunch of sand beneath thousands of feet, was the shrill, wailing and lonely sound of the shofarim. A sound that didn't announce death, but judgment. A sound that was a cry of faith in itself. Every step was an act of obedience. Every meter traveled, a silent declaration that their trust was not in flesh, but in the God who had parted the Red Sea and the Jordan River. Within every Israelite, an internal struggle raged. The voice of reason screamed about the absurdity of the plan. The flesh felt vulnerable under the mocking gaze of the enemy, but another voice, smaller but more powerful, the voice of faith they had seen in Moses, which they had experienced in their deliverance, whispered, "Believe, obey, he is faithful." And so, in a silence that was more eloquent than any war cry, they completed the first circuit. The wall still stood. The Canaanites still mocked, but something had changed, not in the stone but in the spirit of them. They had taken the first step, not toward a city, but toward a collective faith that would soon prove its power to tear down impossible walls.